Hey y'all, and welcome to our third One WILPF call of 2023. As a reminder, these calls are quarterly, and the next call is Thursday, October 12th, which will be the very last one of 2023. I'm Ashley Carrington, located in North Carolina, she, they pronouns, and co-facilitating with me tonight is Mary Beth Gardam from Iowa. Mary Beth, give a wave. And our technical support guru this evening is Ellen Thomas. If you can wave, Ellen, from the mountains of North Carolina. This meeting is sponsored by the members of Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, US section. And as a note, this is a public call, and yes, we are recording. The video will be posted in a few days to WILPF's YouTube channel and the One WILPF Call webpage. And you can look for those links in the chat as well as in the text pad, and Mary Beth is going to be placing those in there now. WILPF is the oldest international peace organization in the world, founded in 1915 by Jane Addams of Hull House. There are WILPF branches across the US, and we are one of the 50 WILPF sections around the world. You can find out more and join us at our website at www.wilpfus.org/join. And that information is also located in the text pad and in the chat. These One WILPF calls connect our organization to one another and keep us strong across the United States. We are women-centered, though we welcome male, queer, and members of the trans community, as well as gender-expansive individuals as well. We are urgently looking for amazing, detail-oriented volunteers to help plan and facilitate the future of these One WILPF calls. So please contact us at info@wilpfus.org to find out more or how you can be involved. And a few housekeeping notes. Please remain muted when you are not speaking to reduce the background noise. And please place any questions or comments in the chat. And Mary Beth will be putting the agenda into the chat now. There is also a Google Doc, the text pad, where you can add in information. Please make sure when you are adding information into the text pad, you add it under the red line. You'll see that within the text pad. Look for that link to the text pad in the chat as well. And these links will be put into the chat continuously throughout the night. All right, so let's roll call. Place your name, your pronouns, and the location you're calling from in the chat. And now passing it over to Mary Beth. Mary Beth?
Hi, everybody. I'm Mary Beth Gardam, longtime WILPF member from Iowa City, Iowa. We're pleased tonight to present an esteemed editor and writer on economic topics, reporting on a development of international economic importance, Vijay Prashad. We'll hear from him in just a moment. We'll also share short update reports from WILPF's Tura Campanella-Cook, co-chair of WILPF's Middle East Peace and Justice Action Committee, and from our Disarm Committee, excuse me, and you'll get also an update from Shilpa Pandey, co-coordinator of this year's UN Practicum for Advocacy in New York City, which WILPF US sponsors at the Commission on the Status of Women event. But first, let's get right to our featured speaker. Vijay Prashad is an American-based Indian historian and commentator. He is executive director of the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research, the chief editor of Leftward Books, and a senior non-resident fellow at Chongyang Institute for Financial Studies, Renmin University of China. Mr. Prashad was the George and Martha Kellner Chair in South Asian History and a professor of international studies at Trinity College in Hartford, Connecticut from 1996 to 2017. During this presentation, if you have questions for Mr. Prashad, please put them in the chat or raise your hand and we'll call on you. So welcome to the One WILPF National Organizing Call, Mr. Prashad. Recently, your article in Popular Resistance captured our attention because of the striking comparison you made between economic and debt policy at the World Bank and the new, more people-centered policies of the new Development Bank or the BRICS Bank. I'm going to put the link to that article in the chat. Your article comes at a time when debt is much on the minds of people in the United States, while we contend with the annual by political gamesmanship around our national budget and the games people play to get the pork that they want. You covered different ways of choosing to deal with debt and ways that don't place that burden on the poorest and most vulnerable people. And you cited the election of BRICS Bank's new chair, a woman of exceptional experience, Dilma Rousseff. Please tell us the significance of Ms. Rousseff's election and how her anti-debt stance may offer hope for global poverty, and anything else you want to tell us.
Well, firstly, it's tremendous honor to be with you. You are a stalwart in attempting to build peace in the world, the very opposite of your own government and most of the media. I mean, the Wall Street Journal, just as an example, just carried a story about, a Chinese spy base being built in Cuba. Hours later, after the Wall Street Journal's really quite remarkable story, even the Pentagon had to deny the story. I found that quite alarming, that the media is so reckless these days in reporting things, almost no care for the truth. So I'm very happy to be here because I know that each and every one of you is not only interested in the truth, which is, I understand, difficult in a so-called post-truth age, but we still believe in the truth. And of course, you believe in peace. So I'm really happy to be here. Before I get to your question about Dilma Rousseff, a quite remarkable woman, I want to talk a little bit about development, just to put this in context. There was no word like development before 1945. I mean, let's face it, before 1945, most of the world was colonized. And, the British colonial authorities were not thinking about the development of India. When the British left India, were thrown out of India in 1947, the literacy rate in India was 13%. That's 13%, 13%. So much for the civilizing mission of colonialism and for any precursor to development. It just wasn't on the agenda. Development as a concept is a post-World War II idea, and it's brought into play largely because of the depredation of colonialism. You see, between the 18th century and the 20th century, the British stole 45 trillion sterling from India. So the Indian people created wealth. Britain didn't reinvest that wealth in India. They took that wealth with them to Britain and invested it in Britain. And so when India won independence from Britain, it was 45 trillion sterling minus at that point. The wealth of India was sitting in British banks. And there was no Marshall Plan for India. There was no reparations for India. And I'm using India as an example. Every single one of the colonized countries could be the example. It's just that a very good economic historian, Utsa Patnaik, she looked at all the data and she put the $45 trillion number together. So I'm using the example of India. India was one of the largest colonies, but this applies to almost the entire African continent, applies to large parts of Latin America, the Caribbean, and so on. So after World War II, there was a problem. There were all these new states in Asia, Africa, Latin America that had won their independence. But in order for them to move a development agenda, a peace agenda, an agenda to have the dignity of their people established, they needed finances. They simply didn't have them. When the colonialists left, they left the banks empty. So these countries had to very tragically go back to their old colonial masters and ask to borrow money. That was the nature of the commercial loans given to the formerly colonized states. Some of this money came as what is known as ODI, Overseas Development, aid and so on, different packages. So there was private sector lending to the formerly colonized countries and public sector lending, some government lending. This lending really is development. What it is the creation of further debt in the third world, instead of development. In fact, a synonym for development from the 1950s onward is permanent debt. And indeed, there has been a permanent debt crisis, so much so that countries from the 1960s started to borrow money not for investment or for trade or to enhance infrastructure. No. They were not borrowing for anything like that, trade, investment, infrastructure. They were borrowing to service the previous debt. In other words, if they had taken a $10 million debt in year one, in year two, they had to pay, let's say, $2.5 million as the interest on the debt. So now they had to borrow $2.5 million to pay off the interest on a $10 million debt. Guess what? By year three, they had a debt of $12.5 million. So now they had to borrow $3 million to pay off the debt servicing, the interest on the $12.5 million quite usurious rates of debt. And you can do this calculation. It's pretty simple. By the time we get to the present day, the debt is in the hundreds of billions. It's unpayable debt. Most of the countries known as the less developed countries, the LDCs, simply have no pathway out of debt, frankly. And the International Monetary Fund, to be very precise about the institution that institutionalized permanent debt, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, based in Washington, D.C., which basically answer to the US Treasury Department, these two institutions pushed a project of debt service financing. In other words, borrow money to pay off your interest, to pay off the wealthy bondholders in Europe, Japan, and the United States. The IMF pushed a program of debt financing, or rather financing for debt servicing. Take finance to service your debt. And if you can't pay that, in order to get the benediction from the IMF, a good report from the IMF, which is just like, a ratings agency rating like Moody's and so on. The IMF rating is very much like an international rating for developing countries. If you do not accede to the IMF pressure, what the IMF is telling you, they give you a bad rating. Well, what is the IMF telling these countries? The IMF is saying, in order to service your debt better, now remember, not to take financing for infrastructure, investment, any of that, just to take financing to pay off the wealthy bondholders. If you're not doing the following things, we'll give you a bad rating, and then you'll have to borrow at a more expensive rate. What did they demand of these countries? Number one, stop spending on health, stop spending on education, stop spending on water supplies, stop spending on electricity, stop subsidizing consumption. Let the private sector take care of it. Now, the burden of the IMF austerity policies was almost entirely borne by women in the third world, who had to go out there and walk kilometers to get water to their homes because there was no pipe created, who had to find a way to get firewood to make food because there was no natural gas piped into their homes, and so on. Why was there no water? Why was there no natural gas? Because the IMF told their governments, don't subsidize consumption. Subsidizing consumption is a violation of free market enterprise. It's a violation of the principles of the free market. Okay? So the IMF enforced austerity on countries that were already in quite dire straits after the long histories of colonialism. You can now understand why people in the third world are deeply frustrated with the IMF and the World Bank. None of them ever, from 1944, from when they were formed in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, neither the World Bank nor the International Monetary Fund at any moment actually moved an agenda for genuine improvement of the condition of life of the vast majority of the people. So none of the countries, Sri Lanka, for instance, 14 different loans from the IMF, now catastrophically in a debt crisis. none of these countries was able to exit permanent debt, and none of them were able to eradicate poverty. I want you to listen to this and perhaps let this register. Not one of the countries that has come under the surveillance of the International Monetary Fund or has received World Bank money has been able to eradicate poverty. Not one country. The only developing country in recent years that actually eradicated absolute poverty was the People's Republic of China. And it was not through IMF funding or through World Bank loans. It's a very interesting development. My institute, Tricontinental, did a study on how did China eradicate absolute poverty. Certainly not by building fantasy spy bases in Cuba, just to let you know. They've been using their resources for the people's benefit rather than to allow billionaires and trillionaires, near trillionaires, to move their money to tax havens. Mostly Western billionaires and near trillionaires move their money into tax havens, which now amount to, at least our institute calculated, at least $32 trillion. Now, just like the British took out the wealth from India, didn't reinvest it in India, US hundreds of millionaires, billionaires, near trillionaires are not investing their money back into the country. They are removing it to tax havens, or they're keeping it liquid in banks and not being made to pay the penalty through any taxation regime. And that money gets, quote unquote, lent to the third world in a kind of mafia-esque structure, which enforces austerity against the very poorest people in the planet. So when Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa joined together in 2009 to create the BRICS project, this project put front and center the creation of alternative institutions to the IMF and the World Bank. The contingency reserve arrangement is the alternative to the IMF. But today I'm not going to share anything about that. That's a separate issue. The alternative to the World Bank is the new development bank based in Shanghai, which is also called the BRICS Bank. And it's now third Secretary General of the BRICS Bank is the former Brazilian President Dilma Rousseff. Now, interesting, Dilma Rousseff was the president of Brazil before she was illegally removed from her presidency by an act of lawfare. Dilma Rousseff was the architect alongside then her predecessor and now current president of Brazil, Lula Ignacio de Silva, known as Lula. Dilma and Lula were the architects of Brazil nearly abolishing poverty. In fact, they came so close, they were feted by the United Nations. And then when Dilma was removed from office and Temer took her place, and then Bolsonaro, poverty rates started to skyrocket in Brazil. So she brings to the BRICS Bank a commitment to ending debt to create austerity and for financing for development, for infrastructure, trade, investment, not financing for debt servicing. So the BRICS Bank has a completely different approach. The goal of the BRICS Bank is pretty much to end poverty. That's the goal. The goal of the World Bank in name is to end poverty, but in fact it is a partner organization of the IMF, which is creating permanent debt. You couldn't have a more stark comparison between these two sets of institutions. The Washington-based World Bank, quote unquote World Bank, in fact, the name is not the World Bank. The official name is the International Bank of Reconstruction and Development, set up after World War II. Reconstruction was Europe and development was the third world. More money was spent in the Marshall Plan than in development projects without a debt component. If you compare the World Bank to the BRICS Bank, it's a stunning comparison. But in this article, which Mary Beth so graciously read and therefore invited me here, I used the occasion of two new leaders of these institutions, Dilma Rousseff, who I've already introduced to you, and a man of Indian origin, who is now the head of the World Bank, who comes from the corporate world. He comes from the world of credit cards and big corporations. Doesn't have one bit of experience in development or what is known euphemistically as poverty alleviation. Not one jot of experience. This is where we are today, friends. And I'm going to wrap up with this, Mary Beth. This is where we are. We're in a world situation now where almost the entire global South is looking at the United States and wondering what's going on. We no longer have faith in your institutions. And yet here you are, fear-mongering about China, which during the pandemic came into 22 odd African countries and just ended the debt, whatever debt was owed to China. And here's the Western media. I mean, just red in the face about these realities in the world, cannot understand why is it that people in Africa, Asia, Latin America just don't believe what the West is saying about China. And look at it this way. Anytime I talk like this, Mary Beth, anytime I talk like this, somebody will say, oh, you're paid by the Chinese government. In fact, my fellowship at Renmin University is unpaid. I don't get any money from the Chinese government. I would like to believe that these are things I actually believe. I don't need to be paid to say them. But this is such threatening stuff that even recently the Daily Beast did an article basically saying you're an agent of China. I mean, for God's sake, when can we have an adult conversation about the state of the world without being like children at the playground, you know, screaming and shouting and tearing each other apart? I happen to believe that China has done something quite remarkable in abolishing absolute poverty. I also happen to believe that Dilma Rousseff has a genuine agenda to end poverty around the world. At least these people have a record of doing that. I don't see any record like that at the World Bank, at the International Monetary Fund, and least of all, dear friends, I don't see any record of that by any US government for its own people. I was recently, for 3.5 weeks, traveling around China. I was in Shanghai for some time, and I drove around all across as much as I could in the city. I didn't see one homeless encampment. You arrive in Los Angeles, you drive into Santa Monica, rich part of the United States. There's homelessness rife in the city. Now people say, okay, the Chinese pick up the homeless and throw them out of the city, whatever. I don't think that's happening, by the way. Journalists have looked into it. But if it were happening, we'd hear about it. And in fact, the Wall Street Journal would have written many, many stories about it. The fact is, that is a project that doesn't want to see homelessness and is embarrassed by that. I don't see any US government, let alone the government in California, you know, a liberal state. I don't see any of these governments, any of them, paying attention to something as embarrassing as homelessness and hunger. I don't see it. So when people in places like India and so on look at these two projects, well, they're not foolish. They're making up their minds. Thanks a lot.
This monthly call has been going on for a number of years. It was monthly, now it's quarterly. And in the past, we had an excellent speaker and historian from Africa who told a similar story, Maurice Carney, and I put the link to that recording in the chat. We also had a man from the US Jubilee Network talking about the crushing debt that has been visited on Puerto Rico and other Caribbean nations. So there are many examples of this. Our committee, Women, Money, and Democracy, has been studying the oppressive nature of debt and the fact that it keeps us as a people, as a nation, as a species, from being the people we were meant to be, from using the qualities and values that we're naturally drawn to, generosity, empathy, all of those things, because debt makes us so afraid. We cannot be who we are meant to be. So with that having been said, I would welcome questions for Vijay, from any of our participants, please raise your hand or put your questions in the chat. I'll check the chat now. Virginia Pratt asks, what can we do to dial back the call to war with China by the United States?
Virginia, what can one say? I mean, I just wrote a story for Globetrotter on the Shangri-La dialogue that took place in Singapore, which happened around the same time as a US and Canadian frigate and destroyer were near Chinese waters, and they almost clashed with the Chinese destroyer. US Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin was in Singapore, and so was Defense Secretary Lee from China. And Defense Secretary Lee said, we need more collaboration. It's very dangerous out there because the United States and Chinese military are not communicating. We need more collaboration. And Austin tentatively seemed to agree with that. But I must say, the political climate in the United States is very ugly right now. There was a study done by Columbia University. Some majority of Asian Americans report hate crime incidents because of the anti-China sentiment that has been rising in the United States, similar to what happened to people who look like Arabs and Arabs themselves after 9/11. It's a very ugly situation. I mean, you have all kinds of strange comments being made by politicians. And I cited the Wall Street Journal article. It's remarkable, the kind of things that can be said and are being said. The Sinophobia. I mean, it's kind of interesting in this case that Sinophobia and the red peril, communism and so on, yellow peril and red peril have collided. And that's a toxic mix. It's bringing out the worst in a lot of people. I very much hope that, groups like yours will be out there trying to talk an ounce of sense to people, to campaign. I know Code Pink has a campaign called China is Not Our Enemy. That's an important campaign. I very much hope you will all join something like that. Talk to your friends. You got to dial this back. I mean, I would like to see liberal, sensible lawmakers stand up and say this is outrageous. But, I believe, and I'm sorry to say so, that they're too scared to put their heads up above the turret. They're just too scared. They don't want to get slammed down by the right wing. And that's a shame. Where is the courage?
Lucille Eckrich, who is with one of our allies, Alliance for Just Money, says, please, can you explain in more detail how the BRICS Bank ends poverty and operates differently than the World Bank and the IMF? In particular, what is the nature of money in and monetary exchange relations within and among the BRICS countries of Brazil, China, India, Russia, and South Africa?
It's a great question. So the first thing to note is that many of these countries in their trade, merely in their trade, are starting to trade in their local currencies. They are trying to, quote unquote, de-dollarize their trade. That's an interesting development. In fact, between Russia and China, the trade is almost entirely de-dollarized. They're trading in rubles and in renminbi. India and Russia are trading in rubles and in rupees. So they are moving from using the dollar to their local currencies. This is not a seamless process. It's not an easy process, but they're already doing that. The interesting thing about the BRICS Bank lending, the idea that Dilma Rousseff has been entertaining, is to lend more directly on investment projects that are going to help build the capacity of countries, build roads, build schools, build hospitals, things like that. What the IMF generally does is it lends to the government in a way that's merely to pay off the debt. The BRICS is trying to say we are not going to actually lend to pay off debt. We're going to lend to do infrastructure projects. I think that's an interesting thing. They're lending is people. Now, how is a country to pay off the debt? And here, I think you play a big role. Movements in United States, in Europe, perhaps in Japan, that we have to insist as well that wealthy bondholders in the rich countries should take a major haircut. They should no longer be able to get payment for those loans, which in many cases were odious loans, colonial loans or loans to dictatorships and so on. We should demand the abolition of a lot of these debts. For instance, just take one example, and I don't know, Mary Beth, if your previous guest from Jubilee took the example of Haiti, but it is obscene that US banks continue to take interest payments from Haiti. It's obscene. I mean, that's just an obscenity. The United States should never have purchased the indemnity that the French enforced on the Haitian people. That was Chase Manhattan Bank. These rich banks, these rich investment companies like BlackRock and so on, use their political power to prevent poor countries from demanding a haircut on their loans. And therefore, most of these countries, many of them, in fact, more than half of the African states paid more to service their debt during the pandemic than they paid on their health care. That was during the pandemic. And who were they paying that money to? Wealthy bondholders in the United States, wealthy bondholders in Europe and in Japan. That's unconscionable. That is the responsibility of people in the North, movements in the North, to lift up a campaign to do a jubilee, as it were, on debt payments from these countries, at least the very poorest, but in fact, I believe everybody. 1985, Fidel Castro organized a conference in Havana, which called for a complete debt moratorium. Nobody listened to him. He was always worth listening to.
Judith Hand asks, how do the efforts of the United Nations to end poverty fit into the picture?
Well, Judith, that's a great question. And I must say, the United Nations is many things to many people. One of the things the United Nations is, which we don't, get enough information about, are the agencies of the UN, like UNICEF, UNESCO, UNRWA, and so on, including FAO, World Food Program, all of these agencies. These agencies right now, Judith, in my opinion, the last 20 years at least, but right now particularly, are expressly committed to preventing mass starvation. So for instance, World Food Program, Food and Agricultural Organization, they don't have a development project. Firstly, they're grossly underfunded. And secondly, they are just airlifting food. Right now, the World Food Program and FAO released a document saying there are 18 hotspots on the planet where there is absolutely certainty of mass starvation, including Sudan, which is in the middle of another political conflict. This is ridiculous, this situation. The UN cannot put forward a genuine development agenda. The one UN agency, the UN Conference on Trade and Development, UNCTAD, the United States has been trying to shut down UNCTAD ever since it was formed in 1964 under the leadership of Raul Prebisch of Argentina. I mean, the US has never tolerated the existence of UNCTAD, which calls for greater state funding to help, erase the burdens on people's shoulders and so on. So when you ask, what can the UN do? Right now, the UN is basically doing a salvage job, trying to prevent mass starvation around the world. It is not able to move a positive agenda.
Trying to see if there are other, if there are hands raised. I see Lenny Villa Gomez Reeves has her hand up. Go ahead, Lenny.
Yeah, I had a couple of questions. And first, I wanted to thank you for this extremely good presentation. Given that the U.S. doesn't tolerate any rivals, what efforts do you think the U.S. is going to take to attempt to undermine the BRICS Bank and other global South-South cooperative efforts, especially, under Dilma, who has a record of actually doing things? Yeah. And then the other question I wanted to ask is, do you think the BRICS Bank will have any effect in improving the financial transaction situation, not only for Cuba, but also for other countries struggling with U.S. sanctions and blockade efforts? Or is the dollar-based effort, nature of the international transaction situation too powerful? Will the BRICS Bank be able to function outside the SWIFT banking system network, for example? So, yeah, I'd be interested.
Well, firstly, Lenny, very good questions. The first question, Dilma Rousseff has been a left-wing, campaigner against a dictatorship in her country. She was arrested and tortured, brutally tortured. She came into politics, faced a coup in 2016, but she is undaunted. I just spent an evening with her in Shanghai. That woman is unbelievable. If anybody deserves the Nobel Prize for resilience, it's her. I think there should be a Nobel Prize for resilience, human resilience. It's a lot better than peace, because we know, friends, that the Nobel Prize for peace don't mean nothing anymore. Okay. Look at the people who won that prize. It's a disgrace. You need to give a Nobel Prize, or, the Women's International League Prize for Human Resilience goes to Dilma Rousseff. Look, there's always a danger that the United States is going to intervene one way or the other to do something nasty. In honor of Henry Kissinger's 100th birthday, I went back and read some of the papers, the correspondence between Kissinger and Nixon against Chile, which will face 50 years of the history of its coup this year in September. Nasty people, I must say. You read Kissinger and Nixon conspiring to overthrow the government of Salvador Allende. Nasty people. They are capable of anything. But I want to say something about that, because I think those days are over. You can overthrow one government, the government of Evo Morales in Bolivia, but the government of Luis Arce will come back. You can overthrow the government of Mel Zelaya in Honduras, but the government of Xiomara Castro comes back. It's very difficult now for the United States to sustain its power. It can try all it wants. It can go and destroy countries, Iraq, Afghanistan, and so on. But from each of them, it's had to withdraw without any major gains. So I feel like people in the United States need to, again, tell their neighbors and friends, got to come to terms with the fact that this is not a city on the hill. This is just another city on a plain. There are other cities. You got to learn to live on the planet as equals, not try to impose yourself as superior. So that's the answer to the first question. They'll try, Lenny, they will try, but I don't think it's going to stick this time around. And I'm interested to see what happens at the BRICS summit in August this year in South Africa. For one, the South Africans have said they'll welcome Vladimir Putin into the country. He's not going to The Hague from Cape Town, where the conference will be held. That'll be interesting. So I'm going to watch carefully what happens in August at the BRICS summit. To your second question, I think even here there are some changes afoot. Okay, United States has used the dollar system to suffocate Cuba, has used the dollar system to suffocate Venezuela, Iran, so many countries. I don't know if you watched that great American philosopher, who was on television recently, Mr. Marco Rubio, who was asked by the television host about de-dollarization. And that great philosopher, Marco Rubio, said something quite true. He said, look, it's terrible for countries to de-dollarize. Because if they de-dollarize, he said, we won't be able to use our economic weapons against them. I thought that was a remarkable truism from that great thinker from Florida. So there you have it. The more you see de-dollarization, in a way, the greater you will find countries able to survive outside suffocation from the United States.
Philip Cole has a question for you. Go ahead, Philip.
Yes, my question would be, China has initiated the Belt and Road Initiative over the last several years. What are the successes? What are the failures of that initiative? And looking at the fact that China's taken over Sri Lanka's main port due to the failure of them being able to maintain the constrictions of their loan, covenants of the loan to Sri Lanka.
See, Philip, that's a really amazing question. There's a great article that you can read in Atlantic magazine by two American scholars about the Hambantota port in Sri Lanka that you mentioned. And why it's a good article is that it's called something like, busting the China debt myth or something like that. And when I read that article, I learned a lot about our problems in the world. You see, the Chinese and others did a study of the feasibility of the Hambantota port in Sri Lanka. And what the Chinese and this study concluded was that the Chinese should give one tranche of money. The port should be partly built and then it should open and start functioning. And as the port starts to make a profit, then they can take more of the tranche of money, a second tranche, and expand the port. Well, the Sri Lankans said, no, we want all the money in one go, which was catastrophic. So they took the loan in one go and they found themselves in a real hole. And they had been warned about that by the Chinese as well. Chinese said, we don't want to give you the money. Sri Lankan government said, no, we want it all in one go. That's in the article in the Atlantic magazine. That's not an article in China Daily. It's not made up by somebody in the Chinese government. That's two US scholars who looked at this very carefully. So what I learned from that story was that our governments around the world, governments in poorer countries, in Zambia, governments in Argentina and so on, need to have a project, need to understand how to best utilize the fact that for the first time in over 50 years, there's an alternative to the World Bank and IMF. And we need to have a project that is rational, reasonable, and well thought out, and not, jump into the pool of money and say, let's take it all now. So I think some of the responsibility must be borne by governments of the South, who have to act in a way with a kind of rationality. We need to look at the possibility and feasibility of our own investments that we make, and also understand that we have to invest in human beings. We have to improve our universities, improve the education system, bring in people to learn science and tech and so on. We can't be dependent on tech from elsewhere. We've got to develop our own tech. So I would say, one of the things that in our institute we talk a lot about is what is the project of the Global South? We can't spend our whole lives complaining about the United States and the World Bank and so on. We have to have our own project. And I think that's part of what the conversation I had with Dilma Rousseff is like, what is the project of the South? And should the South be encouraged to think big, but also think rationally?
Harriet Haywood asks, all of our many free trade agreements are designed to fleece the global South. Do you see a way for these countries to escape the legal repercussions should a country decide to leave the IMF or the WTO stranglehold?
Well, it's again a good question, but it really depends on what's going on. So in the 1990s, for most countries in the world, the principal trading partner was the United States. The United States was the buyer of last resort. It was buying the goods and services from the whole world. Today, that scenario has changed. For most countries in the world, including countries that the United States has drawn into a security web like Australia, Japan, Philippines, for all these countries, their biggest trading partner is China. China is now the biggest trading partner with more countries in the world than the United States is the biggest trading partner, etc. Secondly, this year, for the first time, global South countries, minus China, will have a higher total GDP than global North countries. Now, this has something to do with population as well. Global North countries, merely 14.4% of the global population, so much smaller percentage. Per capita GDP is uneven, but the volume of GDP of the South has grown considerably. Countries like Mexico, Indonesia, Nigeria, and so on have had their own growth dynamics. They are not entirely reliant on the United States. The world is changing, and trade agreements of the old kind aren't going to be the principal issue anymore. In fact, when the Chinese put up for debate the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic, that agreement, the RCEP agreement, it's the largest trade pact in the world. Doesn't include the United States. It includes most countries in Asia, including Vietnam and so on, which have had old animosities with China. In fact, the deal was signed in Hanoi, in Vietnam. Includes Australia. Countries that have a kind of political antagonism with China are actually joining trade blocs with the Chinese. So it's not that trade of the old 1990s kind is going to be the principal problem. I think the principal problem for a lot of countries is not trade rules. It's actually financing. It's actually financing and control over resources. We're back to control over resources, nationalization of lithium. It's the copper of the 21st century. Today in 1970s, the debate in Chile, led by Allende's government, was let's nationalize the copper. Today, the government of Gabriel Boric, not a socialist government at all, but they have on the table nationalization of lithium. We're back to the era of the question of control over resources. It's not trade agreements any longer. That was, in a way, the fixation in the 1990s. Today, the issue is financing and control over resources.
I wanted to let you know that Robin Lloyd says, remembering your appearance in Burlington, Vermont several years ago, sponsored by Towards Freedom. Wonderful to hear your trenchant analysis again. Does Africa have a chance to escape the US and AFRICOM to install neo-colonialism, the efforts of the US and AFRICOM to install neo-colonialism?
Nice to see you again, Robin. Very nice to see you. We at our institute did a study last year, I think, on the militarization of Africa. In 2016, the African Union's Peace and Security Council, which is like the Security Council, voted a resolution unanimously asking for no foreign bases in Africa. It's a long-standing Pan-African demand. News reports started to come out about Chinese bases in Africa. I found that interesting. The Chinese have one base in Africa, in Djibouti. And if you look at that base, it has an interesting history. What is the Chinese base in Djibouti? The Chinese have a base in Djibouti. It's a naval station. It's a naval station the Chinese maintain to support the United Nations project of ending piracy in the Gulf, in the Arabian Gulf. Now, I have a problem with the UN mandate against piracy because it doesn't tackle overfishing along the coastline of Somalia and so on. But let that be. It's actually not a military base. It's a base to support a UN mission. United States and France, on the other hand, have many bases. I traveled to Niger in the Sahel region, went to Agadez, where there's the world's largest drone base. Well, whose base is it? United States. You go up to Arlit, just north of Agadez. It's the center of uranium. Robin, you will remember during the period of the Iraq war, lead up to the Iraq war, there was talk of yellow cake uranium from Niger. Remember that? A diplomat was sent from the United States State Department to investigate. And then his wife, Valerie Plame, was revealed by the Bush White House as a CIA agent. That was the yellow cake yellow cake uranium from Niger. There is yellow cake uranium in Niger. It was not being sold to Iraq. It's sold to the French. Why? If you go to Arlit in the Sahel, the town is garrisoned by the French Foreign Legion. France controls that town. Why? Because almost half of the light bulbs in France are powered by uranium from that town. And there's a military base there. So I don't think the question is, will the West intervene into Africa? The West has never left Africa, which is why in Burkina Faso and in Mali, there have been 4 coups, 2 in each country over the last 2.5 years. Why? To remove the French. And in fact, the governments in Burkina Faso and Mali, run by very young people, have ejected the French from there. They've told the French, get out of Burkina Faso, get out of Mali. And Burkina Faso, Mali, and Guinea are now in a new process to create a federation. But this doesn't stop anything. The United Kingdom, for instance, wants to build a base in Ghana. In Accra Airport in Ghana, an entire terminal number 5, has been taken over by the United States government. And do you know that if a US citizen enters Ghana, you have to go up to an official at a desk at passport control, present your passport, they stamp it, you go in. If you're a US soldier and you enter through Terminal 5, there is no passport control. You can come in and out of Ghana with your gun at will, because that's the agreement that the Ghanaians signed with the US government. So United States is there strangling that continent, Robin, and has been doing this for a very long time. When Stanley met Livingston in the middle of the Congo and said, Dr. Livingston, I presume people should remember that Stanley was a US national. And it was the United States at the table in 1885 in Berlin during the scramble for Africa. The United States has never left that continent. US government with the Belgians conducted a coup against Patrice Lumumba in 1961. That was about uranium, because the uranium that the United States used in the bombs against Nagasaki and Hiroshima in 1945, that uranium was sourced from the Congo, from a mine in the Congo. And the reason the US and Belgium's couped Lumumba was they didn't want that mine to get into the hands of the Soviet Union. I mean, that's the history, and it has never ended, never ended.
I want to get two
Thank
quick
you.
questions in. Janet Slachter has her hand up, and then let's see, Mario Galvan. And I think we're going to have to be done with questions after that. Janet, go ahead.
Yeah, I think, Vijay, that your analysis of how the IMF and World Bank work is absolutely correct and on target. And I would like to think that there's a viable alternative. But I wonder if, okay, here's a question that asks for information. There is a Chinese development bank and there's a Chinese export-import bank. And those are not, those operate similarly to like the IMF and other banks that are, making money. So to what extent is China invested in an alternative to capitalist banking, and to what extent is it playing both sides?
I don't think it's playing both sides, Janet. I think what you've identified is something very important, which is that, look, China is a large country, 1.4 billion people. When I travel to Chinese universities, I'm often stunned and surprised to see how many neoliberal professors are sitting in these campuses. How many of them have Stanford degrees and Harvard degrees, MIT degrees. I'm talking about the economists. The Chinese agencies set up over the last 30 some years are actually not only very similar to US agencies, but they are run by people effectively trained by the same people. They may be Chinese, but they were trained at Stanford or at Chicago. What's interesting is in the last decade or so, and I think the era of Xi Jinping is slightly different from the previous periods. The new institutions set up are in contest against some of these older institutions. I mean, there's a real debate inside China. I don't want anybody to believe it's a homogeneous society. Despite what people may think, there's some real debates in there. And I think that the neoliberals are pretty strong in the Chinese government, particularly when it comes to economic policy. They are not absent. So yes, of course, they exist there. But I think that some of the agencies like the New Development Bank and some of the Belt and Road agencies are not exactly following the nostrums of neoliberalism. The problem, Janet, and here I'm going to be completely honest with you, is the post-development scenario or framework isn't very well articulated. Next month, Tricontinental will release a dossier. It's an extended study on the history of development thought. And we end our dossier saying, can we imagine a new socialist development paradigm? Look at it. This is where we are today. Just asking, can we even imagine it? So I think it's a big struggle, Janet, and I'm not going to fudge around and say, well, this, that, and the other. I think it is very true that there is a struggle inside the Chinese government and the agencies.
Okay, and Mario Galvan, go ahead.
Thank you very much. My question has to do kind of with what you're talking about now. I see the new changes happening in the world, with the growth of the global South economically, and through development. For example, the Belt and Road Initiative. But my question and my concern is that is this new alternative and this new rearrangement of global politics and political power, are they going to be continuing the kind of industrial development that is leading to climate change and the global crisis of the environment that we're happening. Are they addressing I guess the environmental aspects of increased industrial development? I've heard often that the whole world cannot live at the technologically advanced stage that the U.S. and Western Europe are living in. What do you see in terms of that problem? Thank you, and thank you very much for your presentation and all of the work you've done. I've been following you for years.
Thanks a lot, Mario. Thanks a lot. Well, Mario, the most dangerous thing in the city of Shanghai is to stand at an intersection and not look in all directions. And that's because almost all vehicles in the city are electric vehicles, almost all vehicles. All delivery people drive electric vehicles. And I've often been hit by a number of them, okay? It's very dangerous. China is one of the world's leading producers of green technology. I have mixed feelings about the debate around industrialization. I think we're going to have to continue to industrialize, to electrify countries, for instance. We just need better, cleaner energy sources. You don't need to, industrialization doesn't mean carbon heavy industrialization. We've got to be inventive and clever. We can't talk about freezing everything because after all, look at India, hundreds of millions of people in deprivation. I don't want to live in a planet where people don't have access to schools, to electrification, and so on, to enough nutrients to have a good life, some leisure and so on. So we're going to have to see, industrialization take place in many countries, processing take place in many countries. The issue is, will this be based on a power source that's destroying the planet? Will we need to have the kind of extractivism that we've had in the past? So can we be inventive? And I think humans will have to be inventive. We can't have a kind of economic apartheid permanently set in place in order to protect the planet, where we say, look, close down all the coal factories around the world, in the poor countries, because the rich countries have already devastated the carbon budget and the poor countries now have to just live in poverty so the planet survives. It's a super unhealthy approach, right? Obviously, neither you nor I believe that. But we have to be quite clear to people that, there are ways to industrialize and grow things without destruction of the planet. I think we have to look at the kind of energy sources that are out there that are already being, used by places around the world. The Chinese are the largest producers of solar panels. Is that a good way to go? Well, there's some doubts there because batteries are very dirty. Batteries are hard to get rid of. Is there a different way to do a battery? Must it use cobalt, and must it use lithium? And the mining for these things are horrendous. So let's not pretend that green technologies are somehow clean technologies. They have their own dirtiness to them, But we need to think about these things together in an honest and sober way. And I fear the room for that is gone. Look at how strange this is, friends. And Mary Beth, let this be my last comment. It's kind of a sad comment, okay? Look at it. The Green Party of Germany, came out of the forests, the black forests of Germany, screaming about the need to protect the planet and so on, right? And nuclear power in Germany, amazing. And coal-fired power plants in Germany, amazing. Today, what is the Green Party? The Green Party wants more and more war. After all, they got involved in the war in Afghanistan. They pushed the Germans to get involved. They were eager to join the war in Iraq, even though Gerald Schroeder, then Chancellor from the SDP, was very much against that war and Germany didn't join. Today, the Greens basically are saying, let's continue with the Ukraine, with the nuclear powered plants and perhaps even bring back coal because we don't want to cut a deal with the Russians and so on around Ukraine because we're not going to accept their natural gas. So much for being in favor of the planet, so much for being in favor of the planet. This is the descent of environmental thinking. So we need some honesty, clarity, decency in this debate, Mario. I totally agree with you that the issues have to be put on the table. We need people to be able to exit from abject poverty, to live rich lives, not just exit from abject poverty. And for that, I think people have to be sensitive to the fact that hundreds of millions of the people in the planet are in hunger now, and their hunger isn't going to be ended by good words, but only with deeds, and those deeds need financing, and that financing has to come without strings, and those strings have to come with science. And will we be able to do that? Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much for Mr. Prashad for your time tonight. We are really honored to have had you take time to be with us. We look forward to watching to see if the BRICS Bank fulfills its promise for equity. And you are welcome to stay with us for the rest of this Zoom, as is everyone else. There's a lot of really interesting reports coming up, but we'll understand if you have other commitments.
Bye. Thanks a lot. Bye.
Bye, Vijay.
Bye.
Thank you so much, Vijay. As a reminder, we're putting the link to the Google Doc text pad into the chat repeatedly throughout the Zoom, so you can access it to see if there are any extra notes or links or details for actions or recommendations that may not be a part of the recording. Each of our monthly e-news newsletters reports how much our members are undertaking across the country to stand for peace, freedom, environmental, and economic justice on a local to global basis. We don't always know how many people are reading our e-news, but we encourage you to open up those emails and read at least the summaries of the stories and actions that are being carried out on many fronts by our branches and members. It's truly inspiring. On this One WILPF call, we'll also be featuring the inspiring program work of the 3 issue committees: the Middle East Peace and Justice Action Committee, the Disarm Committee, and the UN Practicum for Advocacy we sponsored in New York City in March. Tura Campanella-Cook is co-chair of the Middle East Peace and Justice Action Committee. Tura, we often don't hear about your committee's work on these calls, so thank you for updating us tonight, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Ashley. I put a little report in the text pad, and I will summarize it here. All of us on the issue committees work very hard on our articles, but we don't really know how they are received. Do you find this is new information? Is it old information that makes you zone out? Do you have the information you need to take political action? Do you want to know about other things? And so I have asked for your comments by email to the address that goes to our committee leadership, and I will put it in the chat again when I finish speaking. Our committee does focus on the situation of the Palestinians almost to the exclusion of everything else. We are very troubled by it. We are impassioned to educate on the subject, and it is something we know more about than other topics. But we also want to be effective in your organizing in the context of all WILPF issues, and that's why we're asking for your feedback. Don't be afraid to tell us that things are not working for you or that you want other things, and we will be discussing what our future articles will be. As a short report on our activities, we've been active in 2 areas. One is to press for the implementation of the Global Magnitsky Human Rights Accountability Act. This is an act, usually for very geopolitical reasons, that the US uses to put financial sanctions on government officials or wealthy individuals in countries that we disagree with. The Lebanon section of WILPF asked us in particular to press for the implementation of the Magnitsky Act because they would like it applied to a slew of corrupt officials in their country who are blocking presidential elections and causing impoverishment to the Lebanese people. So we've been working with a caucus in the US House to try to move this forward. The second big thing for us is a new campaign called Apartheid-Free Communities. And its public launch was this week on June 6th, the 56th anniversary of Israel's invasion of the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem. And you will be hearing more about it in an e-news article, which sort of circles back to my first statement about wanting to know your reactions to our articles. That's it for me. And when I stop talking, I will put that email address in the chat. And I urge you as well to look at the text pad. Thank you.
Thanks, Tura, for those details. Next up, we have the Disarm Committee reporting on the actions they are calling for this summer, given how much conflict there is in the world. These are important actions to take. I think both Cheryl Spencer and Ellen Thomas, co-chairs of Disarm, are going to be reporting. So, ladies.
Yes, thank you very much, everybody. And I have put quite a lot of text into that Google Doc that you can find through the chat. And I'm hoping that Ellen will also screen share that with you all so you can see what I'm talking about. So the Disarm Committee is one of the oldest committees of WILPF, because WILPF was started essentially to try to end war. And I have at the top of our section written out the mission of our committee, because we deal with many different aspects of disarmament and ending war. So the bullet points there are, you can look at them later. So then scroll down a bit. So what, of course, we've been focused on very much so in the past year and a half is the Ukraine being invaded by Russia and trying to bring that terrible war to an end through negotiations. So we belong to this organization called Peace in Ukraine, has a very informative website. And just recently, we developed a letter to the three presidents, Biden, Putin, and Zelensky, asking them to please stop the war. And we got it published in The Hill, which is a printed newspaper that gets sent to every congressional rep every day. So we had a 4-page ad, and then we had 80 different groups delivering copies of that ad to their congressional home offices to emphasize that there is a lot of people who don't like this war and think it should be negotiated, ceasefire and then negotiation. So you can see there, you can find pictures of us doing that in that section there. So what's coming up this weekend is the European effort to do the same thing. So there is a conference in Vienna this Saturday and Sunday. Vienna is 9 hours ahead of California. And they will be also broadcasting it live. So if you can get up in the middle of the night, you can hear a lot of people, very knowledgeable people, who are going to be working on this Vienna Appeal for Peace, which is then going to be taken by delegations all over the capitals of Europe to show, again, the politicians that really an awful lot of people want this war to finish. You can register, there's a registration link there to attend this virtually, and bearing in mind it's 6 hours ahead of New York, for example. But I believe it'll be recorded. So you always register for something so you can listen to the recording later. Now, nuclear disarmament is one of our major activities. And I hope you've all heard of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which was started by the Global South. We've heard a lot from Vijay about that. That was a very interesting talk. I appreciate, Mary Beth, that you found this gentleman to talk to us. So we have petitions to the president and the senators, because it's the senators in the US Senate who ratify treaties. There are 2 petitions there in the bullet points. that you can sign if you haven't already, to encourage our president and senators to really seriously think about the TPNW. It is now being in force for 2.5 years. And so one of the things we did in the past, we encourage WILPFers to celebrate those anniversaries. And I'm very happy to say that WILPFers are very good at responding to what Disarm asked them to do. And so we had an enthusiastic celebrations all over the country in 2022 and 2023. Now, a very important nuclear weapons abolition bill that we have been working with Congresswoman Norton for 19 years. There it is, HR 2775, and the text is in that website there. So she needs more co-sponsors, because these bills that Congress people can put forward really only get attention when they have a lot of co-sponsors. So we need you to be talking to your congressperson about this bill. The text is there, and why you think it's very important that we abolish nuclear weapons. And the other part of this bill is that money gets moved over from the $50 billion that are spent every year on nuclear weapons, $50 billion every year, move it over into human needs. Now, there are several bills in Congress that need our attention, and you will see there, HR is a resolution, actually 77, which says to Congress, please embrace the goals and provisions of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Again, it needs more supporters. There are two other bills there. One is to restrict the first use of nuclear weapons, and then the other refers to autonomous weapons system. Okay, we don't want AI to be able to launch a nuclear weapon, because it might make a mistake, and those are very complicated programs. So they want to prohibit that federal funds could actually be used to design such a system. Then, of course, there's this whole humongous military spending that we work on out of Disarm. And we belong to many coalitions, and this is one of them, People Over the Pentagon Coalition. And we have a bill through them, HR 1134, that would take $100 billion off the $860 billion that Biden wants for what they call discretionary spending. It's more than all the other discretionary spending. And again, there is a sample letter. If you go to that Google Docs there's a sample letter for you to write to your rep. I reckon there's about 10 things we want you to write to your rep about. So you could, I think separate letters would be better. Now, some particular actions coming up shortly. NATO, we consider NATO, WILPF is against NATO. We think it's a perpetrator of offense. It's supposed to be defensive, but we see it as an offensive organization. The NATO will be having its conference, summit in Vilnius in Lithuania, and it's difficult to get there. So there will be some protests in Brussels. And on the 7th to 9th of July, we're waiting now for a declaration by Global Women for Peace Against NATO to be posted. And when that's posted, we will let you know where it is and how you can personally sign it. Another action that we're going to be asking WILPFers in later July. So Oppenheimer, known as the father of the atomic bomb, has a book was written in detail about his whole biography. Now, somebody has decided to make it into a dramatic film with very famous actors, and it's going to be premiered on the 21st of July in cinemas all over the US. We would like that WILPFers stand outside the cinema, maybe go see the film first, then stand outside the cinema as everybody comes out and tell people, that nuclear weapons are a scourge, that we need to get rid of them. And we will be giving WILPFers some more ideas of the materials they could use as they stand outside the cinemas. But there will also be a documentary film, which is also listed there. That's going to come out through Peacock, the NBC streaming service. And one of our WILPF members, Hibakisha, she is actually featured in that film. So we will be asking you all to watch that when it's available. Another process we're going through is to try to reach out to climate and environmental activists. So again, another coalition we're members of, Warheads to Windmills. And they're going to have a webinar on the 24th. There is the link there, and it's going to be 9 a.m. to noon in California. On that day, trying to work out how we can actually get to the green economy sooner. And then we're also reaching out to healthcare professionals. Because that's where we'd rather have healthcare funded, not warfare. That's the on this Saturday will not overlap with the Vienna talks because they're in a different time zone. So again, if you want to see how we're trying to connect nuclear weapons and the money spent with them and how it should be spent on well, things that civilians will benefit from, please sign up, and the register link is there. And then we also I hope that those of you in DC especially, as you know, the war in Korea has officially not finished. It's just an agreement between the North and the South not to fight anymore. So the Korea Peace Action Group, again, which is a sister organization of WILPF and Disarm, is having a treaty event in DC on the 27th of July. They would like people who live around DC to please go to it. So all in all, we have lots of things to do. We have, 60 people on our list. You're welcome to join Disarm, the committee. We meet twice a month on a Sunday evening. And Ellen, is there anything I've forgotten that you want to point out?
Well, the Warheads to Windmills folks are going to be in DC lobbying on behalf of Eleanor Holmes Norton's bill. The July,
Yes.
is that July 12th? Was that?
11th and 12th.
11th and 12th, and they're inviting people to join them. And if you want more information about that, then you can get in touch with us with them through us by writing to disarmchair@wilpfus.org. And as for Ms. Norton's bill, she's been introducing it not for 19 years, but for 19 sessions since 1994. God bless her.
Okay.
So, and that's all I had to add. Thank you very much, Cheryl.
Okay.
Good job.
So please join us. We have lots for you to do. Things that wouldn't take you but just a few minutes to carry out, others that take more time, but it's always more gratifying, I find. The more work you put into something, when you see a result, it's very gratifying. So thank you, everybody. Thank you, Mary Beth, for giving us this opportunity to tell people about our committee. Thank you. I'm done.
Thank you, Disarm, for the heads up about how we can take actions for peace this summer. In March, we sent a delegation of members and students to the UN Commission on the Status of Women for the first time in 3 years. Now that COVID is somewhat in the rear view, Shilpa Pandey asked for time to report on how the program went this year. Shilpa?
Thank you, Ashley. I'm happy to report that while this program has been a program of WILPF US for a number of years, due to COVID, it could not take place for 3 years. And I'm very excited to announce that after a hiatus of 3 years, we were able to resume this. And I'm also happy to report that we were able to attract 4 students, 3 from the Boston University and 1 from Florida International University, who participated as our UN Practicum participants. And for those that I would retrace my steps a little bit back, for those that need to know a little bit more about this program, through our consultative status to the UN, WILPF US sponsors 2 concurrent programs, separate but concurrent. One is the Local to Global, and the other is the UN Practicum in Advocacy. Local to Global is for our own members, our seasoned WILPF activists, and UN Practicum in Advocacy is to attract students and students who are enrolled in university to attend this program. We are very excited that we are able to resume these programs, but we are also excited because we have a new committee that we have formed, and we will be looking at ways how we can integrate these programs more with the rest of our sections. And when I say integrate, I mean that when the participants return from the New York after attending the CSW, what are some of the ways that in which we can involve and integrate what these participants learned during this week in the New York and take it back to their branches and local community level. One more thing that I'd like to report regarding this program is that we are planning to open the practicum in advocacy, which used to be traditionally restricted to students enrolled in universities. We are planning to open this up for who may not be actively enrolled in any university, but maybe working in nonprofits or just activists. And sometimes, people have different reasons and situations because of which they are not able to pursue higher studies, but they are activists and interested in learning more about peace advocacy. And through this program, we want to encourage their participation and also encourage women's leadership amongst the younger demographic. So that is pretty much what I have to report. I would actually be very happy if you have any questions, please reach out to me. I can share my email address. And I think we will continue to send more information during the later part of the year, because in August is when we will start the recruitment and the solicitation for applications for this program. So that's when we'll have more details. But as of now, we are happy to announce that we have resumed these programs. These are very much on. And that's about it. Thank you.
Thanks, Shilpa, for that update. It'll be really interesting to see how this program evolves next year. Next, we have some announcements from the Cuba and Bolivarian Alliance Committee about an action coming up in July. Welcome, Lenny Villagomez-Reeves and Cindy Domingo.
An action coming up in June, but that's okay. You don't even have to wait till June. Although the week of June 19th through 25th is the center of this action, we'd like to encourage you at any time to help encourage President Biden to remove Cuba from the U.S. list of state sponsors of terrorism. In real life, Cuba is a sovereign nation that's recognized for its leadership in healthcare, women's rights, LGBTQ+ rights, and education. But the U.S. government has a different and kind of unique view. Officially, Cuba's categorized as a state sponsor of terrorism, and this was redone by executive action during Trump's last days in power. However, Biden hasn't taken any action to remove Cuba from this list and seems to be actively hostile to the idea. It's a ridiculous designation, but the results are real. You've already heard about the fact that the U.S. Pretty much controls international financing. So Cuba, as a result of being on this list, in addition to the effects of the blockade, has even more severe difficulty with financing and trade. And this is still reversible by executive action. So get in touch with Biden. We need your help. Tell him Cuba's state sponsorship of terrorism designation, it's unwarranted, it's unjust, it's extremely harmful to the people of Cuba. It's also harmful to the people of the US, since it's very morally corrupting to be complicit in this much cruelty and dishonesty of our government. Member organizations of the National Network on Cuba, and WILPF is one of the member organizations, have been working on this off the list campaign. And the current action is going to be in DC on June 23rd through 25th. If you're in DC, Go to the National Network on Cuba, NNOC.org, and you can find out all about the actions. And you can also find out if there's something taking place in your locality. I also put this info on the text pad, and I put the link on the text pad, so that's a lot easier than remembering NNOC.org, National Network on Cuba. The other thing that you can do, some Florida Republicans have introduced a bill to try the Force Act, HR 314, to try to make it impossible for the president by executive action to remove Cuba specifically from the state sponsors of terrorism list, even though that list is put together and removed by executive action in general. And so contact your congressperson, contact your senator, say vote no on HR 13, the Force Act, because it's a bad idea. Thanks. Remember, for more information, NNOC, National Network on Cuba.org. Links in the text pad. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Lenny. And thank you for updating us on your committee's continuing actions. Next up, a quick report from the Women, Money, and Democracy Committee. Mary Beth chairs that group. Mary Beth?
Thank you. Our committee, Women, Money, and Democracy, is the committee within WILPF that works on economic justice issues. Odd for a peace organization, maybe, except that we have been aware for all of our 108 years that economic justice and injustice actually leads to conflict and war. So addressing economic justice makes perfect sense. We've been busy, and we have a very busy summer planned. In May, WILPF Women, Money, and Democracy co-sponsored a 4-session study course with our ally Alliance for Just Money to examine monetary reform as a viable means of system change. And we had many members, several members participate, and I think that they are planning to schedule that and run it again in the fall. So look for a word about how that might work. And our committee and WILPF US was mentioned in Ricky Gard Diamond's article about public banking in Ms. Magazine recently. Our advocacy work continues for public banking. Vijay talked about the culpability of the big Wall Street banks and the way that they use their power and money against sovereign nations. They also use it against American citizens and states and cities by using local dollars against the interests of those people and denying loans, denying support for affordable housing. They don't have our best interests at heart, and public banks could really help change that. WILPF Women, Money, and Democracy will also be represented at the National Organization of Women Conference in Alexandria, Virginia in July. We'll be sending some brochures to encourage new membership as well. And Women, Money, and Democracy will be represented by Dee Murphy at the 22nd Century Initiative Conference, Forging a People-Powered Democracy in Minneapolis, July 6th through 9th. Women, Money, and Democracy at WILPF addresses systemic economic injustice and threats to democracy from corporate power, racism, and debt money used as oppression. We meet the third Tuesday of every month at 8 p.m. Eastern. If you're interested in joining us, contact me. I'll give you the email address in the chat, and you can find us at our webpage. That's all I got. I wanted to introduce briefly Rowan Faircloth, who is our Poor People's Campaign liaison. WILPF has partnered with the Poor People's Campaign for a number of years, and Rowan wanted to just give us a quick update. We haven't heard much about what's going on at the Poor People's Campaign. Rowan, what can you tell us?
First of all, my last name is Fairgrove, like a
Oh,
beautiful grove of
sorry.
trees, not cloth.
As soon as I
That's
said it, I
well,
thought that was true.
That's unique. Yeah, no one's ever done that one before. So I put a lot of information on the text pad. Basically, last year, many of us headed to Washington, D.C. for the March on Washington. And this year, we are turning more inward. There will be a Moral Poverty Action Congress, IMPACT, in Washington, D.C., June 19th to 21st. And it's stalwarts of the Poor People's Campaign organizing, and we're going to get training on moral fusion organizing and theomusicology, and we're going to visit our senators and representatives on the Hill, and there will be a demonstration on the steps of the Capitol, which of course, as a wheelchair user, sort of scares me as an idea, but we'll see how that goes. Each state who has a coordinating committee is sending 20 delegates. I'm one of the delegates from California, and I will be reporting to E-News on what happens, but we're coming together to get trained so that we can come back to the states and do big actions in our state capitals this fall. And then next year, we will once again march on Washington around summer solstice. So next year you will hear all about it. We'll be organizing with the Get Out the Vote. We'll be organizing against voter suppression and for the 140 million poor and low wealth people to have a voice in our society. And so I will keep you updated, and I hope that you will join us next year and in your state capitals. And that's pretty much all I have to say.
Thank you, Rowan. Y'all, unfortunately, that's all the time we have for this One WILPF call. Remember, the next call is Thursday, October 12th at 7 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Central, 5 p.m. Mountain, and 4 p.m. Pacific. Again, Thursday, October 12th. Please make sure to lock that into your calendar right now. If you are on our mailing list, you'll automatically get an e-alert reminding you, and we'll announce our featured topic in that e-alert. If you or someone you know has interest in helping plan the October call, please email info@wilpfus.org as soon as possible. Again, that's info@wilpfus.org as soon as possible. Thank you for being with us, and have a wonderful evening.
And be sure to hang on for the informal soapbox segment immediately following this call, where we get to hang out with each other and check in about what's going on in our lives personally, and what activism we're doing that we may not have gotten to report on here. Let's all unmute and say goodnight. And like I said, hold on if you can, and we'll do a quick soapbox.
Good night, everyone. Thank you.
Good
Night.
night.
Thanks for a
Buddy.
great program.
Thanks for coming.
Wonderful.
Great job, Mary Beth.
Thank you.
Fascinating speaker.
Fantastic
Really was.
speaker. We couldn't have gotten better.